The silence, currently residing within the hollowed remains of the South Bethlehem works, is a heavy, unnatural thing, a stark departure from the rhythmic, earth-shaking thrum that defined the American century. For over 140 years, this was not merely a manufacturing site, it was a sovereign industrial state, a volcanic forge where the very skeleton of the modern world was cast into existence. To stand before the 5 surviving blast furnaces, those blackened, rusted iron sentinels known as the steel stacks, is to stand in the nave of an industrial cathedral, a place where the prayers of a nation were answered in molten iron and cold, unyielding steel. This is the narrative of Bethlehem Steel, a company that grew so large it became synonymous with the American identity, only to be consumed by the very permanence it sought to build. It is a story of engineering genius, wartime miracles, and a catastrophic institutional hubris that ultimately left a 95,000-person ghost and a $4 billion hole in the social contract of the Lehigh Valley. The foundation was poured in the anthracite-choked valleys of Pennsylvania in 1857. Born as the Saucona Iron Company at the critical junction where the North Pennsylvania and Lehigh Valley railroads met. It was a strategic masterstroke of logistical geography, placing the forge at the exact point where the fuel of the revolution met the transport of the future. Under the stern guidance of engineering legends like John Fritz, the father of U.S. steelmaking, the company transitioned from iron rails to the ferocious heat of the Bessemer process. By 1873, the air in Bethlehem was thick with the chemical signature of progress. The rapid oxidation of silicon and carbon, a violent molecular dance that transformed pig iron into a substance 16 times more durable. This was the era of the rail, where Bethlehem iron provided the literal tracks for the westward expansion, forging the iron veins of a growing empire while simultaneously securing the defensive future of the nation through the production of heavy armor plate for the United States Navy. The true corporate metamorphosis occurred in 1904 when Charles M. Schwab, a man defined by a ruthless, high-stakes cult of personality, formed the Bethlehem Steel Corporation. Schwab was an industrial titan who understood that dominance required more than just production. It required an obsession with vertical integration and technological differentiation. He recruited Eugene G. Grace, a disciplined electrical engineer whose clinical management style would provide the necessary counterweight to Schwab's grandiosity. Together, they transformed a regional railmaker into a global powerhouse, acquiring iron mines in Cuba and shipyards from Quincy to San Francisco. This was the birth of the modern integrated steel mill, a sprawling ecosystem that controlled every stage of production, from the raw ore dug from the Caribbean earth to the finished naval vessel sliding into the Atlantic. Under Schwab, Bethlehem Steel was no longer just a company, it was a vital organ of American sovereignty, a forge that never slept, and a fire that never went out. In 1908, Bethlehem introduced a technological revolution that would physically redefine the American skyline, the gray rolling mill. Before this moment, buildings were limited by the structural fragility of traditional beams. The new mill produced the nation's first wide-flange structural section, a single piece of steel of unprecedented strength. This Bethlehem beam became the literal skeleton of the skyscraper age, allowing architects to dream in vertical miles rather than city blocks. It was so fundamental to the company's identity that the profile of the wide-flange beam was immortalized as the centerpiece of the corporate logo, a symbol of structural integrity that would eventually support the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, and Rockefeller Center. Every time an American looked up at a city skyline, they were looking at the material output of the Lehigh Valley, a testament to a time when Bethlehem Steel provided the very bones of the modern urban landscape. The company's strategic dominance was built upon a sophisticated application of the razor and blade business model to heavy industry, a maneuver that ensured decades of recurring profitability. While the massive capital projects, the bridges, the skyscrapers, and the naval hulls served as the razor to capture the market, the true profit centers were the high-margin proprietary blades provided by the BethForge and machinery divisions. Bethlehem would sell the installation of a massive naval shaft or a utility turbine at competitive rates, knowing that the specialized hardened steel components could only be replaced or maintained by Bethlehem's own shops. This ecosystem was reinforced by the development of high-speed tool steels in the heavy gun shop, a breakthrough by Frederick Taylor that allowed for precision boring and machining at speeds that left competitors paralyzed. By locking customers into a proprietary cycle of high-margin replacements and specialized forgings, Bethlehem created a financial flywheel that made it the nation's second-largest steel producer and a dominant force in global manufacturing. The brand's legacy reached mythical proportions during the global conflicts of the 20th century, where it functioned as the arsenal of democracy. During World War II, under the absolute production mandate of Eugene Grace, Bethlehem's 15 shipyards achieved the impossible, launching 1,121 ships in a span of 4 years. At the height of the effort, in 1943, the company was launching a ship a day, a rate of production that remains unmatched in the annals of industrial history. This was the era of the USS Lexington and the USS Missouri, vessels armored with BethForge plate that was designed to be as hard as glass on the outside to deflect shells, while remaining flexible on the interior to absorb the kinetic energy of impact. 300,000 workers, nearly 200,000 of them dedicated solely to the shipyards, labored in a continuous 24-hour cycle of sparks and noise, proving that the American industrial machine could outproduce any adversary through sheer volume and technical precision. The physical world is still held together by the steel that poured out of the Lehigh and Saucon plants during the company's golden era. Nowhere is this more iconic than the Golden Gate Bridge, a project for which Bethlehem fabricated 80,000 miles of wire and massive structural trusses. The very color of the bridge, the world-famous international orange, found its origin in the red lead primer applied at the Bethlehem foundries to protect the steel during its transcontinental journey. The structural integrity of the George Washington Bridge, the Verrazano Narrows, and the lock gates of the Panama Canal all bear the invisible mark of the Bethlehem Forge. For decades, the company was the architect of the American century, providing the material foundation for the nation's most daring engineering feats. It was a time of absolute certainty when the smoke rising from the South Bethlehem stacks was viewed not as pollution, but as the visible evidence of a thriving, invincible economy. Inside the gates, the Bethlehem plant was a complex social microcosm, a melting pot that was strictly ordered by an ethnic and religious hierarchy. The workforce was a mosaic of European immigration, yet the roles were rarely fluid. German immigrants were the smart machinists, Hungarians were the tough blast furnace operators, and Slovaks were the diligent men of the rolling mills. The most hazardous and punishing labor, particularly the tending of the toxic coke ovens, was often reserved for Hispanic, Mexican, and Portuguese workers. This stratification even extended to faith, with Protestants preferred for the Lehigh plant and Catholics for the Saucon plant. Yet, despite these divisions, a singular identity emerged through the union and the legendary Bethlehem Steel FC, a soccer team composed of immigrant workers that became a national powerhouse. They were union brothers first, bound together by the heat of the furnace and the shared risk of the shop floor, creating a community identity that would eventually be tested by the company's slow, agonizing decline. The 1950s represented the zenith of corporate bravado, an era when executive compensation and architectural grandeur began to outpace industrial innovation. In 1958, President Arthur B. Homer was the highest-paid business executive in the United States, overseeing a company that was manufacturing 23 million tons of steel annually. It was a time of lavish bonuses and loop management training programs designed to produce the next generation of industrial leaders. The company felt untouchable, shielded by its massive capital reserves and a domestic market that seemed to have an insatiable appetite for steel. However, beneath this veneer of dominance, the seeds of obsolescence were already taking root. While Bethlehem executives enjoyed their perquisites, competitors in Japan and West Germany were rebuilding their war-torn industries from the ground up, implementing radical new technologies like basic oxygen furnaces and continuous casting that made Bethlehem's aging open-hearth plants look like relics of a bygone age. The ultimate symbol of this corporate hubris was Martin Tower, the 21-story world headquarters completed in 1972. Designed in a unique cruciform shape to maximize the number of prestigious corner offices for the executive suite, the building was a testament to lavish and cozy interior design, featuring hand-woven carpets and custom-etched hardware. Standing 332 feet tall, it was the tallest structure in the Lehigh Valley, a boxy monument of steel and glass that looked down upon the very mills that funded it. But the tower was a lighthouse for a ship that was already taking on water. The decision to invest millions into a palatial headquarters rather than modernizing the landlocked, high-freight production lines of the Lehigh plant would go down as one of the most significant strategic failures in American business. Martin Tower was a monument to the past, built at the very moment the future was disappearing. A physical manifestation of a company that had fallen in love with its own legend. The fracture finally became visible on September 30th, 1977, a day remembered in the Lehigh Valley as Black Friday. In a single devastating move, Bethlehem Steel laid off 10,000 workers, a social shockwave that signaled the beginning of the end for the integrated steel era. The reasons were a perfect storm of internal and external failures, the rise of low-cost foreign competition, the emergence of domestic mini-mills like Nucor, and a management team that had spent decades kicking the can down the road on technological investment. the landlocked geography of the Bethlehem plant, once a strategic asset, was now a liability. The cost of hauling raw taconite and coal by rail made the facility's output fundamentally uncompetitive in a global market defined by sea-level efficiency. The black snow that once fell on the city was no longer seen as a sign of prosperity, but as the soot of a dying industry that had failed to adapt to the environmental and economic realities of a new world. The financial autopsy of Bethlehem Steel reveals a catastrophic collapse of the 20th century social contract driven by the crushing weight of legacy costs. By the late 1990s, the mathematical reality of the company's survival had become impossible. There were only 13,000 active employees supporting a staggering retiree population of 95,000. This created a pension-to-paycheck inversion that added $65 to the cost of every single ton of steel produced, a 14% surcharge that no competitor had to bear. The company was essentially a massive, underfunded pension and healthcare fund that happened to make steel on the side. In 2001, with a pension shortfall of $4.3 billion and $3 billion in unfunded healthcare liabilities, the giant finally buckled. The subsequent bankruptcy filing didn't just end a company, it devastated the lives of thousands of retirees who saw their healthcare benefits unilaterally eliminated and their pensions taken over by the federal government at reduced rates. The final pour at the Bethlehem plant took place on November 18, 1995, a somber, ritualistic conclusion to over a century of fire. As the last heat was tapped from the basic oxygen furnace, the workers played God Bless America, a final salute to the industry that had built their homes, their schools, and their identities. The fires went out, the smoke cleared, and for the first time since the Civil War, the air over the Lehigh River was still. The dissolution of the company in 2003 and the sale of its remaining assets to the International Steel Group marked the definitive end of U.S. ownership of this industrial legacy. The brand that had armored the Iowa-class battleships and spanned the Golden Gate was liquidated, its name scrubbed from the ledgers of the Fortune 500, leaving behind a sprawling brownfield and a community left to reckon with the debris of a fallen titan. The physical erasure of the company's corporate presence reached its climax on May 19, 2009, with the televised implosion of Martin Tower. It took only 14 seconds for the 21-story cruciform structure to collapse into a mountain of dust and twisted rebar, a visceral metaphor for the end of the traditional industrial era in America. The tallest building in the valley, the site of so many corner office dreams and strategic blunders, was gone in less time than it takes to tap a furnace. To the thousands who gathered to watch, it was a funeral for the company that had defined their lives, a final admission that the age of big steel was truly over. Yet even as the tower fell, the Bethlehem beam remained, not as a product for sale, but as the hidden structural core of the nation's greatest cities, a legacy of strength that persists long after the fires of the forge have cooled. Today, the Bethlehem Works have been transformed into Steel Stacks, an ambitious arts and culture campus that treats the ruins of industry as a sacred monument. The 5 surviving blast furnaces are now an industrial cathedral, illuminated at night by a sophisticated LED system that simulates the heating and cooling cycles of the steel-making process. The red glow of the furnaces no longer signals the production of iron, but the preservation of memory. The National Museum of Industrial History now occupies the former machinery buildings, housing the very tools that built the American century, from the heavy boring machines to the specialized tool steels of Frederick Taylor. It is a place of pilgrimage for those who remember the sound of the mill, a site where the rust is not seen as decay, but as the patina of a heroic past. The legacy of Bethlehem Steel is no longer found in its stock price or its tonnage, but in the enduring structural integrity of a nation that was quite literally built from its fire. The tragedy of Bethlehem Steel is the archetypal story of the legacy brand, a trajectory of emergence, dominance, and eventual ossification. It is the story of how a company's greatest strength, its massive scale and institutional permanence, became the very thing that prevented its survival. By the time the world changed, Bethlehem was too heavy to move, bound by the iron chains of its own history and the mounting debt of its promises. It remains a cautionary tale of industrial hubris, a reminder that even the strongest steel can fatigue if the foundation is not maintained. Yet, as the sun sets over the Lehigh River and the lights of the steel stacks begin to blow, one cannot help but feel a sense of awe at the sheer ambition of what was accomplished here. For over a century, these mills were the heartbeat of a superpower, a place where the fire was never allowed to die, and where the future was forged in the heat of a 1,000-degree furnace. In the end, Bethlehem Steel was more than a corporation. It was a testament to the human capacity to shape the world through labor and ingenuity. The ethnic neighborhoods of the South Side, the navy blue kits of the soccer club, and the international orange trusses of the Golden Gate are the true monuments to this legacy. They speak of a time when the American worker was the primary engine of global progress, and when a single city in Pennsylvania could provide the material basis for the world's most iconic landmarks. The rust may have claimed the machines, and the dust may have claimed the tower, but the steel remains. It is in the bridges we cross, the buildings we inhabit, and the history we inherit. The fire is gone, but the structure stands, a permanent reminder of an era when Bethlehem was the forge of the world, and steel was the measure of a nation's soul. Looking back at the 1904 formation, Charles Schwab could never have envisioned the 14-second collapse of his tower, yet he would have recognized the grit of the people left behind. The community of Bethlehem has not merely survived the downfall, it has reclaimed it, turning a site of industrial decay into a beacon of cultural renewal. The industrial cathedral is no longer a place of toil, but a place of celebration, where the next generation learns of the strength that came before them. The story of Bethlehem Steel is a closed chapter, but its influence is a continuous thread in the fabric of American life, a narrative of integrity, failure, and the enduring power of what we build. As the furnaces glow red in the Pennsylvania night, they serve as a reminder that while the company may be gone, the spirit of the forge is eternal, a ghost in the machine that continues to haunt and inspire the American imagination. We are left with the archives, the black and white negatives of men in heavy leather aprons standing before a river of fire, and the clinical precision of the BethForge blueprints. These artifacts tell the story of a precision that bordered on the divine, a time when 1,000-ton forging could be machined to the width of a human hair. The technical parameters of this legacy, the Bessemer oxidation, the Gray rolling mill, the scientific management of Frederick Taylor, are the lessons of a vanished age. They represent the peak of a certain kind of American genius, one that believed there was no problem that could not be solved with more heat, more pressure, and more steel. It was a beautiful, terrible, and ultimately unsustainable dream, but for a century it was the dream that built the world, and its echoes still vibrate in the air of the Lehigh Valley, a low-frequency hum of a giant that refuses to be forgotten. The legacy of Bethlehem Steel is a monument to the complexity of the industrial age, a mixture of immense productivity and profound social cost. It is a story that ends in bankruptcy and implosion, but it begins with a vision of a nation that could build anything it could imagine. As we look upon the rusted stacks and the empty machine shops, we see the remains of a titan that once bestrode the earth, providing the armor for our wars and the foundations for our peace. It is a narrative that demands respect, even in its failure, for the sheer magnitude of its ambition. Bethlehem Steel is gone, but the industrial cathedral remains, a place of quiet reflection in a world that has moved on to lighter materials and faster cycles, a reminder of a time when the measure of a man and a company was found in the fire of the forge and the strength of the beam.